Hi, guys. We're going to talk about neglect, abuse, and exploitation. A lot of times it's abbreviated ANE, abuse, neglect, exploitation. Now, this is a very important video um, because we have to care for our residents, and it's important that we know what is neglect, abuse, and exploitation, because not only should we be treating our residents with dignity and respect. Like I told you, your number one job is to keep your residents safe, right? And so we want them to be free from neglect, abuse, and exploitation. Now, becoming an aide means you are a mandatory reporter. That means that if you suspect it, you need to report it. With most facilities, you would go to your charge nurse, and then you also have to talk to a abuse officer, which is usually like the administrator. That's the person that would call state. But the important thing is, anytime you suspect it, you need to report it, but you need to follow the chain of command. Now, the chain of command is the line of authority in a facility. Say you're the CNA, right? And then there's a CMA, then there's a charge nurse, and then there's a nurse manager, and then you've got an assistant DON, and then you've got a DON. So by following the chain of command, it protects you from liability. One, you're telling them, you're reporting things. Two, it holds people accountable, right? We know if you're reporting it to your supervisor and documenting correctly, that we're going to know who's supposed to be, who dropped the ball, or who is responsible for taking care of things. So that's why we always follow the chain of authority, or the line of authority, right? Chain of command. So let's start out with going over some definitions first. I'm going to read these to you. Neglect is the failure to provide care or services that are responsibly necessary to ensure safety and well-being and avoid physical and mental harm or illness. Negligence is the failure to use the care a reasonable, prudent person and a careful person would use in a similar situation. Now, there are two different kinds of neglect. There is active neglect, meaning you've been trained as a CNA, you'll know how to take care of people. If you fail to do that, you're actively neglecting somebody. There is passive neglect, which is sometimes family members don't know you need to reposition people every 2 hours if they stay in bed, or you have to change their pants frequently and do pericare, and they just don't have the knowledge to care for their family, and they end up getting bed sores or UTIs. So after you're trained as a CNA, it's active neglect because you know better. And if you do not take care of residents the way you were taught, that's neglect, right? Now, some examples, somebody falls because you forgot to put the call light next to them. You don't put their stuff in reach where they can reach it. You don't wash your hands, and so you're passing pathogens and they get an infection. You're not changing them or reposition them and they get bed sores. That is actively neglecting them. Now, the next one is abuse. Abuse is defined as an act intentionally or recklessly causes harm or is likely to cause harm to a resident. Now, to me, I always think neglect, you're failing to do something, right? That a reasonable, prudent person should do. Whereas abuse, you're doing something that causes harm, or you're not doing something that causes harm. Excuse me. So when we talk about abuse, we have to talk about some different terms. Now, assault. Assault is the threat of hurting somebody, right? You threaten them. Battery is when you put hands on, you hurt them somehow, right? You cause them physical pain. Okay? So assault is the threat, battery is the hands on, right? Now, if we speak bad things about people, we are committing slander, okay? If we write negative things or bad things about people, that is called libel. I always think literary, like you're writing something in literature, right? Or reading literature. If you write it, it's libel. So those are kind of different things you have to consider when you're thinking about abuse. How were they abused? Now let's talk about different types of abuse. What do you think? How many are there, right? Physical, right? What about verbal? Mental? Emotional is kind of a mental. Sexual? There are multiple different forms of abuse that are actually happen in nursing homes or long-term care facilities. Now let's talk about a few. Sexual abuse is probably one of the ones that tugs at my heartstrings the most, because it's just thinking that of people sexually abusing elderly or anybody for that means really tugs on my heartstrings pretty bad. Now, you might have heard the story about a resident in a long-term care facility. She delivered a baby while in a coma. She actually had drowned at age 3, but they've kept her alive on life support, and now she's age 29. Well, last year she delivered a baby while in a coma. Come to find out, the male LPN had been raping her and didn't feel like he did anything wrong because he loved her, right? A little closer to home here in Wichita, they found a maintenance man raping a 98-year-old non-responsive resident. It's pretty sad, isn't it? Now, there are tons of stories. If you ever want to Google it, you can, but be aware there are tons of stories. Unfortunately, they hit close to home here in Wichita, as well as everywhere across the country. You got to be aware to watch for things for sexual abuse, bruising in the inner thighs, or hypersensitivity when they're being touched in the perineum. Now, you have to realize that this can be from previous abuse. One of the worst things that I remember when I was an aide was we had this poor woman, and she was incontinent of bowel and bladder, meaning she wet herself and pooped herself, right? And any time we had to do pericare on her, she would just start crying and say, "Please, Daddy, don't touch me there. Please don't touch me there, Daddy, please." And she would be bawling, and I'd be almost bawling, and so we deal with people that have been through sexual abuse, so we've got to be respectful, and we have to talk to the residents. This is where you're going to learn about hand over hand, where you put their hand down there too, so they think they're doing the cleaning, right? So sexual abuse does happen. So be aware of signs of sexual abuse. Now let's talk about verbal abuse and mental abuse. They kind of go together. Now, obviously, calling names, cussing at people, threatening people, the assaulting people. This is a big concern for me in nursing homes, because sometimes we don't think about what we're saying when we're around residents. A lot of times aides have a tendency to talk to each other and not to the residents, and we say things we shouldn't be saying. For example, what if you're helping, two of you are getting a resident up, and you're talking to each other about the guy in the last room just pooped all over himself and painted on the wall with it and how disgusting it was while you're getting a resident up. How is that resident going to feel? How would you feel? Right? And so we've got to be aware of the way we're coming across, right? That resident's going to think, what's she saying about me in the next room? Or talking about staff members. What if you're in a room taking care of this poor resident and all of a sudden you start talking about the other aides and how mean they are and how rough they are? What's that resident going to feel when they come in to take care of her next time? They're going to be scared to death, right? You got to be careful. Now, that to me is something that if you're always talking to the resident when you're giving care, you will avoid talking around them things you shouldn't. I have an example of one of the instructors said that she was an administrator at a facility, and a woman with dementia who hardly ever talked started talking about this illicit sexual encounter, right? She talked about what positions they did, what the guy's name was, where he touched her, how many times they had sex. And so what do we have to do if somebody reports they've had sex with somebody with dementia? You know, the dementia patient said somebody had sex with them. We have to call state and report it, right? So the administrator was talking to the nurse that was on duty, and another one of the aides goes, wait, what was the guy's name? And so she told him, and she goes, you need to go talk to this aide. That's her boyfriend's name. So come to find out, that aide had totally disclosed her sexual encounter at breakfast in front of this resident to another aide while she was feeding this resident. Not appropriate, guys. You can't do that, right? So her defense was, oh, she has to mention she was deaf. She'd never remember or hear, she wouldn't hear or remember it. Besides that, she didn't talk. No, they might not talk, but they might not like you, you know? Sometimes if people aren't talked to, they just cease to talk. You know, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's not that they can't, they just choose not to. Now, physical abuse is pretty obvious too. You cannot physically harm these people. Hit, kick, bite, everything. But the important thing is we handle them with care, right? I'll never forget, I lifted somebody and kind of tossed her into her wheelchair, and she looked at me and she said, you just threw me like a sack of taters, right? Got to be careful. Sometimes we get pretty rough. These people are 90 pounds soaking wet, so we have to be gentle when we're transferring, okay? We got to be careful with that. Now, as far as exploitation, that's taking personal property. Let's see, taking unfair advantage or personal property, right? Now, big things, taking money, checks, credit card numbers, personal items. I've had people steal jewelry and hawk it at the pawn shop. The other things that you might not think about are every time you go in the bathroom and wash your hands, you use her lotion, or you use her body spray, or you know where her full-size candy bars are and you eat it, right? That's not okay. They don't have that much stuff. It is not right for you to take it from them. Another thing is, I have to think where I was going, sorry. You have to be aware of all these things. When you get a feeling that something's not right, when somebody's caring for someone, doesn't matter if it's a nurse or a med aide, a CNA, physical therapist, you need to make sure and report it. Like I said, your job is to keep residents safe. See you next video.